Hi authors, my name is Jennifer Carr and I'm here to help you write more realistically through psychology. As a former high school AP psychology teacher and marriage and family counselor, I have insider information that can help you write better stories and more relatable characters. Today's topic is one that might hit close to home for some of us, as it's one we've all dealt with in some form or fashion. It's also a topic that, when written correctly, can have a major impact on the growth and development of your characters. It can also impact your readers on a very raw emotional level, which can keep them invested in your story. Today, I'm talking about grief. It's not the happiest topic, but it is one that can deeply and genuinely reverberate with your reader if you carry them through the process with your characters. When grief becomes the topic of conversation, it's typically talked about as an emotion that coincides with death, the loss of a person someone was close to or cared for deeply. The truth is, grief is much more than that. It's the combination of thoughts and feelings that accompany loss of any kind. It's a natural process that plays a huge role in coping with loss and trauma. What's interesting about grief is how it varies in its presentation from person to person. You may have heard that there are stages of grief through which individuals go through as they process their emotions. On many levels, that's true, but what you have to be careful of is making grief a generic process that's predictable and uniform. Just as every individual has a unique past, culture, personality, and traits that are specific to him or her, each person processes his or her circumstances and emotions differently. Any kind of change in our familiar territory elicits some kind of stress reaction, whether it's a positive change that brings about positive stress or a negative change that brings about negative stress. Our systems go through a process that is supposed to help us cope with the new emotions. When the change is negative, our body's systems, physical, emotional, mental, all of them go into overdrive, attempting to make sense of the change and bring us back to equilibrium. Grief is an intense emotional reaction to loss. It's quite possible that you are familiar with what are known as the stages of grief, and they are usually given as steps that a person is expected to take while walking through the process. These stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. While these are all very possible and probable stages through which a grieving person will walk, I'm here to tell you that grief is not a linear process that is this cut and dry. And when you're writing a grieving character, whatever his or her loss may be, it's okay to start them in a stage I may not even have listed here. So how do you know where to start your character's grieving process? Well, that's simple. If you know your characters as thoroughly and intimately as you should before you start writing them, then you know exactly how they would respond to a major loss. So what do these proposed stages look like? Well, just for inspirational purposes, not because you're going to write a textbook character from a can, I'll briefly touch on the original 5 stages and then give you a few more likely components of grief that show up in various forms depending on the person and the circumstances of the loss. Denial is often called the first stage of grief. As a person is trying to absorb the loss and any trauma surrounding it, it's very easy for a person to deny or pretend the loss didn't actually happen. Any kind of loss is a blow to our normalcy, and sometimes it's easier to ignore it or block it out completely. It's definitely not a good long-term solution for working through a loss, but it's also a natural reaction. The second stage is anger. There's typically some extreme emotional discomfort when dealing with loss, and anger is an emotional response that helps us feel less vulnerable. It's like a shield that allows us to express our feelings without judgment. Most of the time, anger is a fear response, and fear makes us feel vulnerable, and anger protects against that vulnerability for a time. Bargaining is the third stage in the process called grief, and when loss occurs, we might find ourselves willing to do anything to stop the hurt, to stop the pain, to fill the void. Bargaining is the point at which the victim of loss agrees to do something in return for relief from the pain. This is the point at which we cry out to God or to the universe and beg for a change in circumstances. Feelings of helplessness define this stage. We feel out of control and in need of help as we realize there is nothing we can do to influence or change the results. The next to last stage is depression, and this does not mean clinical depression, though if that is already an underlying factor, it can be made worse. The panic and feelings of anger begin to subside, and we're forced to face our new reality. Being social can become more of a chore as we withdraw and begin to process our true feelings about our loss. Sadness and lower moods are more frequent in this stage. Finally, we reach acceptance. Reality sets in, and while the loss is still very real and we feel it, it's no longer the controlling factor in our thoughts and behaviors. We don't struggle to change or survive. These are the original 5 stages of grief that psychology set forth several decades ago. However, there are other phases and components to grief that you can take into consideration as you create and develop characters who experience loss. Shock and numbness. This is just being unable to respond at all. Yearning and searching. We look for comfort to fill the void, maybe reliving memories, etc. Despair and disorganization. This is when hope is hard to even consider. Reorganization and recovery. We attempt to reconnect with those we left behind in our grief. Pain and guilt. These emotions exist as we try to balance needing more help and not wanting to be a burden. Also, it's present when one person survives and another person does not. This is called survivor's guilt. And then hope. Finally, hope comes when acceptance is near. The negative feelings aren't gone, but they're also not controlling. Remember, everyone processes grief differently, and I would encourage you to, rather than see it as an even level steps, view grief as a cycle, like waves hitting the beach. Some waves hit harder than others and at different times. The waves are always there, but they're always changing. And never discount a wave. Each wave serves a purpose, even if that purpose is not easily seen right away. Just like grief is a dynamic process, your characters are also dynamic. Don't let them fall flat as they experience loss and grieve. Let their grief serve a purpose and drive them toward a bigger and better story. If you want to dive deeper into topics like these, hit the follow button. If you have questions or suggestions for future topics, leave them in the comments below.